My name is Vishwas. I'm the principal investigator for the Emancipatory Future Studies in the Anthropocene project here at WITS. The project is really about trying to find ways forward that are coming from below in the context of a heating world. Our research agenda spans various things. It spans climate temporality and how that changes our life worlds. It spans green ecotopia, dystopia, and how do we use that to ask questions about the world we're living in. It spans systemic pathways into the future that are being built, climate jobs. It relates to food sovereignty pathways. It relates to ideas around commoning and things like that. So we've had various speakers that have come here onto this public platform to share some of the work they are doing in this country. The last speaker we had in this room, Zayan Khan, spoke about the indigenous food knowledge commons in South Africa. Most of us don't know that there's food around us because we have mono-industrial, globalized diets. But yet there's so much to eat and we're blind to it. And so this is part of Emancipatory Futures. Tobias, who I've introduced just now, the talk we're going to hear today will fit partly into this theme around climate justice futures. It'll also fit and overlap with another theme in our project, which is about grand ecocentric futures. How do you bring about the transition from coal-based fossil fuel energy systems, but also to decarbonize our entire societies? And how should that transition happen? What are the modalities, what are the challenges, the conditions, and the agency dynamics of that? So he'll also kind of straddle that kind of thrust in our thinking. We are very excited to host Tobias to talk to us today about struggling for a carbon-free future, lessons from the climate justice movement in Germany. We felt this topic was very apposite. It was timed in the wake of September 20th. Many of us took to the streets when Greta Thunberg and the Fridays for Future movement called for climate action in the world, raising the alarm bell and so on. Many of you in this room joined us outside Sasol. It also comes at a time when we are poised to host a conference in South Africa to bring together 5 years of thinking around the drought and climate justice issues, bring together sort of public submissions for a climate justice charter, bring together think pieces that various activists have written in the country that will inform this climate justice charter, and also ideas we received from several constituency dialogues, including from trade unions. Gideon is the General Secretary of Solidarity. They were part of a dialogue we had with trade unions in South Africa, where we were thinking through what should be the alternatives for the transition in South Africa. So we're having a big conference this month, to bring together all of this and crystallize out the draft climate justice charter. So, then of course you had the big UN COP meeting, and the UN in its kind of public relations sort of vaunts the success of its climate diplomacy, etc. But when you really look at it, only 6% of emissions can be tackled with some of those commitments made, etc. So really it's a flash in the pan. It's a lot of propaganda, if you like, to be crude about it, but it's really not where the world should be. So Germany has been an exciting flashpoint against, if you like, carbon-based extractivism. There's been an exciting movement that has risen there, led by young people. They've been at it for a long time. Is it called Indigelände? Yeah, it's called Indigelände. But he'll say more about all of this. So let me just introduce Tobias so we can think with him, engage with him, and learn lessons for our context. Tobias is a PhD researcher on labor-environment relations at the University of Kassel, Germany, as well as an activist in the climate justice movement in Germany. In his research, he focuses on coal transitions and the relations between jobs and the environment and labor-environment movement. So he's here in South Africa to deepen his research agenda. He's developing a bit of a comparative framework. He's talking to unions, learning about what unions are doing around the just transition. But he's also kind of situating that in dialogue with what's happening in Germany. Over to you. You have 30 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Vish. and thank you for hosting me here at Wits University, facilitating that talk. Also, thanks to Soraya, who's helped me with setting up all the technical, been running around to get cables and speakers more than once. So yes, I will talk about the climate justice movement in Germany, the conflict about coal, because it revolved around a lot of the question of coal, and the successes and challenges. And so the title is perhaps a bit misleading because I will not draw any lessons for the South African context because I don't feel qualified to do so. But you may decide afterwards if you can draw some insights and lessons, and we can talk about that afterwards or not. So thank you for the opportunity to present. I'm curious to hear your thoughts afterwards. The question that kind of will guide my talk is that one. So it's the one, to what extent does the climate justice movement in Germany challenge the hegemony of fossil capitalism? Now, to clarify that, there are a few terms I will just very briefly introduce without going into depth. First term is fossil capitalism. I took that from Andreas Malm, who wrote this book, Fossil Capital, and in that book he traces the close historical links between the extraction, combustion of fossil fuels and the rise of capitalism. And with regard to tackling the climate crisis, this points to the need to challenge both the energy basis as well as the mode of production. The second term is hegemony, and I use the term in reference to the Italian thinker Antonio Gramsci. Hegemony refers to the organization of consent in society that maintains an existing social order. So in this case, it refers to how dominant social beliefs are oriented towards that it's a good thing to burn fossil fuels, that there is a couple benefits that go with it, such as jobs, development, cheap energy, and just in general that it promises to offer a good life for the many. Now, with the climate crisis, these promises are harder to maintain. And there's arguably a window opening up to challenge this consent and to build counter-hegemony. And one of the drivers of counter-hegemony can be, under certain circumstances, there can be social movements. And social movements understood as networks of individuals, groups and organizations bound together by a collective identity that engage in social conflicts and drive social change. And arguably, or what I will argue, is that the climate justice movement is a counter-hegemonic movement. And in this talk I will sometimes make a distinction between the climate justice movement and a broader climate movement. So both fight climate change, but for the climate justice movement it's less a technical question of so and so much CO2 in the air. It's more a question of power relations that perpetuate the climate crisis and global inequalities. So that out of the way, I now begin talking about the climate justice movement in Germany. That has come up mainly as an anti-coal movement, so I will be going through the conflict about coal. And there's four phases to this conflict. There's the phase of conflict emergence, the conflict then escalates, there are attempts to negotiate a compromise, and then usually what you expect after the phase of negotiating compromise would be kind of a slowing down of conflict and pacification of the conflict. So this has not taken place. Actually, we have seen an escalation of the conflict again, and the conflict has spilled over into other fields. So now just a bit on just a background context on coal in Germany. That's important to understand the conflict. So coal makes up around 40% of the energy mix. 23% is from lignite, which is a coal that is of lesser quality. It's also more dirty than hard coal. And this is mined in Germany in large open cast mines. And the rest, 70%, that's hard coal that is imported from Russia, the US, Colombia, and South Africa. So it's not being mined anymore in Germany, but it's still being imported and combusted into electricity, made into electricity. So there's two main mining regions. One is in the west of Germany, one in the east. In the west is called in the Rhineland area, east is Lusatia. And those regions are Europe's largest carbon emitters. And this may maybe surprise some of you because Germany has it's often been referred to as kind of this green frontrunner, this champion of renewable energy and so on. And there has been some deployment of renewable energy over the last 20 years, but a big part of this has been as additional capacity. So the amount of coal used for electricity generation has actually not been reduced that much. And I won't go into detail here about the energy transition. We can maybe talk about that a bit in the discussion, but it's an important background. Now, in order to adhere to the Paris climate goals, so to have a 2/3 chance of staying under 1.5-degree global warming, studies have shown that a complete coal phase out in Germany would need to take place by 2030 at the latest, and almost half of the capacity would need to be shut down in the next year. So that's the challenge. And there have been a couple of, this challenge has been compounded by a couple of other challenges. So, for once, there's very strong kind of entanglement between, in the region, between the provincial governments, the municipalities, and the energy corporations. So the municipalities, they get their income from business taxes, and they hold shares in the energy corporations. And especially in the east of Germany, the mining region is a rather structurally weak region, and there's now also a surge of right-wing nationalism. There's in general a very strong identity in the regions as coal mining regions, energy producing regions, and then there's also the challenge of energy security, challenge of economic competitiveness, so I won't go into that. And there's a challenge of what I would call the lingering effect of carbon democracy. So there's not many jobs in the coal sector in Germany, it's about 20,000, but those jobs are quite well-paying jobs, and they have relatively good working conditions, and there's a high union density in the coal sector and in the related energy-intensive industries. So that creates a problem, as we will see later. Now, now enter into the conflict. The climate justice movement in Germany emerged just before, a few years before, the climate conference in Copenhagen in 2009, COP15. And the idea was then, it's a grassroots movement that came up, and the idea was to mobilize to Copenhagen, join there with a global climate justice movement, and push for an ambitious international agreement. So what happened was Copenhagen failed, no agreement was reached, and the climate justice movement in Germany afterwards went in kind of a slowdown phase of reorientation and just went into decline. And then around 2010, 2011, the decision was made, okay, we will stop doing this global summit hopping, we will not go to the global climate conference anymore, we will focus on the local level. And there's two implications for that, and that come with that. So one is a number of struggles have taken place around the remunicipalization of energy under the frame of energy democracy from 2010 to 2014, around that. And the second implication is that climate justice activists now begin to target the sources of carbon emissions. So climate justice activists, they set up so-called climate camps in the coal regions, and they were kind of spaces for activists to converge and to discuss which steps to take for a coal phase out. And then in 2014, all of the relevant climate justice groups in Germany came together and formed the Ende Gelände campaign, that Wish also mentioned. Ende Gelände is a saying in Germany, it means here and no further. And it refers to leaving coal in the ground. And the campaign, it wanted to force a conflict on coal. It demanded an immediate coal phase out and linked this to a demand for global climate justice and system change. And in 2015, 2016, then the first mass actions of civil disobedience took place both in the west and the east of Germany in the two major coal mining regions. And I will show you a video of the 2016 actions so you get a bit of an impression what these actions look like. I hope this works.
Probably about 3,000 in the whole terrain around here. 1,000 to 1,500 have come from all over Europe.
We're here to stop the trains from coming across the tracks because we believe in climate justice and we want the coal to stay in the ground.
I feel it's an honor to be here, so yeah, I'm very happy.
We know that you're lying.
We need to act in every way we can. And civil disobedience is one of them.
Whatever it takes, we have to stop goals.
The people got the power. People got the power. Tell me, can you feel it?
Okay. Okay. So the central tactic of the Ende Gelände campaign have been mass actions of civil disobedience in occupying and blocking coal infrastructure. And just a word on civil disobedience. Civil disobedience has a long history from Gandhi to Rosa Parks to the anti-apartheid struggles here in South Africa. And civil disobedience is the deliberate overstepping of legal boundaries in order to create public awareness about injustices. Since such actions are illegal and they can elicit repressive response by the state, but crucially depends on how society responds to it. So although they are illegal, they may seem to be nonetheless as legitimate means of protest. And Ende Gelände has this this consensus in their actions that says we do no harm to people, there's no destruction of property going to take place, people will stay calm and they will not escalate any situation. And just to give you just a brief insight of how these actions kind of work, how they're set up, the dynamics of it, just walk you through very quickly through how these actions take place. So there's a camp being set up on the weekends of the actions where people come together, they do kind of trainings, so they learn what to expect, how to respond to it. Then they join up into small groups of people, so-called affinity groups, people they know, people they trust, people they will take decisions with on what to do in difficult situations. These kind of groups form into larger groups of up to 1,000 or more people. They're so-called fingers. So there's a couple of these fingers, and they're color-coded. So here you see the red finger kind of setting himself up to get to go. And these fingers then, they start to, on the day of action, they go out of the camp. They start kind of legal demonstration marches, so the police will walk with them, and they take a legally assigned route. That gets them kind of close to the target. And at one point then people just start kind of breaking out of that demonstration. They kind of try to spread out, and they try to what's been called flow through the police lines. And it's been a tactic that's been practiced by the anti-nuclear movement in Germany, by the anti-globalization movement in Germany, and it's been quite successful. So it's the idea of people spread out, like you can see in this image. It's not a very good image, but it shows you a bit how it works. People spread out in one long line. So that forces the police also to kind of spread out into long lines. And we see on the wall up there, police kind of trying to get there. And so you see the mine in the background. As the police lines need to spread out, there's gap emerges in the police lines and people can just go through. Some of them might not make it, but most of the people will get through, and then people converge basically again afterwards once they reach then their target. And then I show you now just a short clip from the 2018 action that shows quite well how this works.
Wir sind über 5000 Leute, der Weg wird vielleicht ein bisschen länger, aber wir sind alle total motiviert. Wir gehen jetzt los Richtung Tagebau. Wir werden die Kohleinfrastruktur von RWE blockieren und den Kohleausstieg einleiten.
Wenn wir uns die Klimakrise anschauen, dann sehen wir, dass sie jetzt akut ist. Deswegen brauchen wir einen sofortigen Kohleausstieg. Und das, was die Kohlekommission jetzt gerade macht, entspricht nicht der Realität des Klimawandels. Wir müssen jetzt handeln. Deswegen sind wir hier, um zivilen Ungehorsam zu leisten und mit unseren Körpern die Kohleinfrastruktur, die unsere Zukunft zerstört, aufzuhalten.
blockieren, um einen sofortigen Kohleausstieg selber in die Hand zu nehmen, weil die Landesregierung hier mit RWE Hand in Hand dafür arbeitet, dass in einem kapitalistischen System Braunkohle weiter verfeuert wird und der Klimawandel weiter angeführt wird.
Okay, so as you've seen in this video, this was the 2018 action, so that's been larger already than the action 2 years ago. And since 2016, we see an escalation of the conflict, with more actions taking place, with a higher frequency, they last longer, they draw more participants. And then what happens in the fall of 2018, fall of last year, the Hambach forest moves into the spotlight. So the Hambach forest is a forest located right at the edge of one of the coal mines in the Rhineland. And the forest has been occupied by activists since 2012. So they built tree houses and they stay in this forest and stop the mining company from clearing the forest. Now, social movements, sometimes they draw some of their strengths from sometimes being underestimated by their opponents. And once in a while, their opponent makes a major strategic mistake. And this is what happened in the conflict about the Hambach forest at the end of last year. So, in the fall of 2018, at the height of the climate debate in Germany, the Energy Corporation moved forward and want to expand the mine, want to clear the forest to get on the coal that's underneath it. And they called on the provincial government to evict the forest occupiers, which they then did under the pretense of the tree houses not adhering to fire safety regulations. So maybe that's a German thing, but with fire safety regulations you can just justify about everything. So they did that over a couple of weeks in the largest police action in the region. The police destroyed tree houses in the forest, but they were also met by quite strong opposition by the occupier, by community activists, and the larger climate movements and NGOs that mobilized 50,000 people at one point to a demonstration at the Hambach forest. This picture you can see up here. And finally then there was a lawsuit made by one of the environmental NGOs, and that was successful and prevented the clearance of the forest due to biodiversity concerns. So around the same time, however, not only the environmentalists mobilized, but there were also counter-mobilizations by trade unions that also drew tens of thousands. Here on the banner it says, we are fighting back against the social blackout of whole regions. So I won't go into that now, but maybe also something for the discussion. Then as the conflict now escalated, government tried to solve this conflict in the corporatist fashion by setting up a commission. The governmental commission is called the Commission for Growth, Structural Change and Employment. It's commonly referred to as the Coal Commission. And that commission brought together politicians with stakeholders from industry, unions, NGOs, community initiatives and science. And it was long unclear if they would actually reach a compromise. And the NGOs had threatened a couple of times to leave the commission, but then by February 2019 they agreed to a compromise that included a coal phase out by 2038 and the shutdown of little more than a fourth of the capacity by 2022, and a preference for reserving the Hambach forest and some measures also on structural change in the regions. Now, what was expected to happen was that afterwards, reaching this compromise on the coal question, that the conflict would be resolved. But as we can see now, the results that came out of the Commission have actually not been very well received in the public debate. And instead of slowing down and pacifying the conflict, it actually escalates again. So a range of new actors arrive on the scene, and most importantly, perhaps the youth-led school strikes, Fridays for Future, that really kick off in Germany. They called for a climate strike in September that brought 1.4 million people to the streets in Germany. And there is a broadening of struggles now taking place. So climate justice activists still focus on lignite. There's 2 actions this year. One is actually coming up in a few weeks. But there have also been new actions on imported hard coal. There have been actions against civil disobedience, against industrial agriculture, against the auto industry, against the flight industry, and so on. Okay, so much about the conflict. I will now then turn to some of the challenges and successes that the climate justice movement in Germany faces. So one, movement building. With regard to movement building, this has been very successful. The climate justice movement was very successful in kind of plugging people into the movement to these kind of low-level, open, transparent actions of civil disobedience. And for many taking part, it's this profound experience, and it empowers people that they can actually, with their bodies, stop the diggers, and actually have an effect they can see, and they can do something. So this is very empowering. It builds a strong collective identity. People go home, tell their friends. They might become involved into a local group, activist group, and they come again the next time and bring their friends. So this has worked quite well. What has also worked well is the creation of kind of a well-functioning, what I would call an ecology of movements that consists of alliances and a division of labor between the activists going into the mines, the more militant activists occupying the Humber forest, the environmental NGOs organizing legal demonstrations that reach more people, filing lawsuits, and local community activists that have been vital for creating local support for the actions, both in a logistical way, but also in granting kind of a social license to operate for the climate justice movement in the core regions where they're not always welcomed. So that's another thing maybe for later. And the third point is there has been quite successful internationalization of the movement in two ways. One through participation, so participants come from all over Europe to participate in the mass action, and then secondly, this action model has also been adapted in other countries such as Poland and Czech Republic, who built an anti-coal movement around the same kind of strategies and tactics. Now, with the broadening of the climate movement, with Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion emerging, there's now both an opportunity and a challenge to embed a climate justice perspective in this kind of broader climate movement. And then also with the widening of the arenas of struggles now into other sectors of society, there's both an opportunity to strengthen the movement and to broaden the movement, as well as, of course, the challenge of not losing focus in all these struggles. Then with regard to the coal phase out, so the climate justice movement has been quite successful in putting the coal phase out on the political agenda through these disruptive actions and through kind of good storytelling of kind of this David versus Goliath type, you know, like the protection of the Humber forest by a few activists sitting in the tree houses against the big energy corporations and the massive police coming and trying to evict them, or people putting their bodies in front of these massive diggers. It just makes for very good storytelling. And that's been also the theory of change. So the theory of change has been mobilize many people to do these disruptive actions against coal, create these images, and shift the public debate towards a coal phase out. And then politicians in office, they will have to act if they want to be re-elected. Now, the climate justice movement has succeeded in basically convincing the public of the need for a fast coal phase out. There's a poll from 2018 that says 75% agree to coal phase out taking place as quickly as possible, 67% say by 2025. Now, that is in very stark contrast to the decisions of the Coal Commission to end coal by 2038. And this has been a problem because this transmission belt between changes of public opinion and policy decisions, this has not been working. And it's a challenge for the climate justice movement then how to not only gain discursive power, but also gain institutional power to translate mobilization into meaningful policy changes. The third point, the third field of challenges relates to going beyond the coal phase out to broader questions of social transformation. Now, the climate justice movement demands system change and a radical transformation. Well, the dominant answer to the ecological crisis is more of like a greening of the existing mode of production and living. In German context, there has been a rollback of the energy transition. It started out originally with strong focus on social ownership and decentralization, and this has been reversed somewhat since 2016, switching from a feed-in tariff to a competitive bidding system. And there's now a need to go beyond only disruptive action and to link climate justice and energy democracy, and to revive these struggles around energy democracy. And more broadly, there's a challenge to develop a broader system change agenda, and there has been some good thinking and many proposals on this. So I think more importantly even is the need to develop a theory of change and a praxis of consistent change. So how do you mobilize around an agenda of system change and put that into practice? And then the last point, and this is perhaps one of the greatest challenges actually, that's the relationship between labor and environmentalism. because that was marked in the config code. This was marked by high tensions and even confrontations, even physical confrontations at times. So the question now is if and how it is possible in Germany to build red-green alliances between climate justice activists and progressive unionists. And also the need to center the pressing issues in the daily lives of working people, the means to secure livelihoods, access to infrastructure, health, and so on, and build an inclusive climate justice movement around that. And this is also important because when it comes to the jobs versus climate justice dilemma, we already see now on the horizon in Germany the next big challenge, and that is the auto industry. So the transport sector in Germany has not reduced emissions, and there's a need to transform the auto industry. And while in coal there were only 20,000 jobs, in the auto industry in Germany it's 800,000 jobs. Also good jobs, strong identification with the jobs, they're essentially important to union power. So we see that the next big challenge coming up. And also not paying sufficient attention to these social questions, I would argue would deepen this divide between climate and social justice, and leaves open a flank for right-wing forces to exploit these social frustrations and insecurities, and to build a populist climate denialism that paints climate politics as an elite agenda. So I think this is an important challenge of how to combine the red and the green. So to just quickly wrap up, and then to come back to the question I posed in the beginning, has the climate justice movement been successful in challenging the hegemony of fossil capitalism? I would say partly yes, we're building a strong movement, challenging the hegemony of coal, but as I've said, there have been problems institutionalizing the gains. There are challenges ahead in pursuing a broader system change agenda, in centering popular struggles, and building broad alliances between labor and environmentalists. And just a few points on the way forward. I think it's important that the climate justice movement continues to escalate these anti-fossil fuel struggles on many fronts now and connects the dots between struggles in the energy and transport and agriculture sector. It's a need to develop a theory as well as a praxis of transformation, and to build alliances that can unite the red and the green. That's it. Thank you very much for your attention.